The rain poured down onto Westbrook Airport, as if the sky itself were venting its fury on the earth. Torrential downpours slammed in relentless waves, turning the runway into a dull gray ocean, where airplanes lay motionless like forgotten toys. Their metallic wings dripped steadily, shimmering faintly under the soft yellow lights reflected from scattered outdoor lampposts. Inside the terminal, the air was stifling, and an overwhelming sense of fatigue hung over the crowd. At Gate B12, the digital board flickered constantly, displaying the cold message "delayed." The waiting seats were sparsely occupied. Some passengers had their heads resting on their suitcases, while others quietly pulled their coats tighter around them as the damp, chilly air slowly seeped through their skin. The loudspeakers repeated the apology for the delayed flight in a monotone, as if even the system had grown tired of endlessly offering consolation. In the midst of this, another sound sliced through the weariness. Click, click, click. It wasn't the hurried sound of high heels tapping or the rushed roll of a suitcase. The sound was steady, firm, and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of resolve. It all came from a small figure, persistently stepping through the slippery hallway, Lily Thompson. She was only 11, small and frail, nearly swallowed up by her old, faded green raincoat. Her skin was pale under the fluorescent lights, her lips a shade of pale pink, and her face wore eyes that were large, round, and strangely tirade a weariness not of a child who had been playing, but of one who had endured silent battles for far too long. Beside Lily, striding confidently like a living shadow, was Apollo, her German Shepherd service dog. He was large and strong, but exuded a complete calmness. Apollo was not a pet. He was a guardian, a companion, a protector, a part of Lily that words could never fully describe. Apollo walked slightly ahead of Lily, his head held high, ears erect, and sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. With every step, every solid placement of his paws, Apollo sent an unspoken message: I am here. I am guarding. I will not let anything harm this child. Lily gripped the leash tightly with both hands. Her fingertips were pale, but her arms did not tremble. She knew that in a world that was rarely kind to the vulnerable, Apollo's steadiness was the only tether keeping her safe. They silently moved towards the B12 gate area, where only a few passengers remained. No one noticed. No one cared, until Candace Miller saw them. Candace, dressed in a sharp flight attendant uniform, tall and slender, with blonde hair neatly tied back, was standing behind the check-in counter, flipping through a notebook with her slender fingers, her nails painted bright red. The first glance Candace gave Lily and Apollo was not one of curiosity or sympathy. It was a quick furrow of the brow, almost subconscious, and then it was immediately replaced with a professionally fake smile. But Lily was all too familiar with that kind of smile. It carried the taste of suspicion, of prejudice carefully honed over years. Candace quickly shut the notebook and stepped out from behind the counter, walking quickly and stiffly, her high heels clicking sharply on the cold ceramic tiles. When she was only a few steps from Lily, Candace spread her arms wide, positioning herself directly in front of the girl. It wasn't a violent move, but it certainly didn't need to be so overt. "Excuse me," Candace spoke, her tone as cold as the rain outside. "I need to check your medical service animal documentation." No greeting, no smile, just suspicion wrapped in the thin veneer of fake politeness. Lily said nothing. She pulled an old plastic card from her raincoat. It was her certification that Apollo was a legal service dog, in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act data. Her hand trembled slightly as she extended the card, but her gaze never wavered from Candace. She didn't look away. Candace didn't bother to take the card. She only glanced at it and smirked. "There are very clear rules about animals here," Candace declared, her voice louder than normal, enough for the nearby passengers to look up. "We can't allow pets to roam freely like that." She emphasized the word pets with a bitter tone, as if Apollo were a stray dog with no owner. Lily bit her lower lip. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers beginning to turn toward her, kind of looks she had endured for years: suspicion, pity, discomfort. Apollo stepped firmly in front of Lily, his body tense, his intelligent eyes locked on Candace, calm yet unyielding. Candace took half a step back in reflex, but quickly regained her composure, glaring at Lily. "You need to understand," she lowered her voice, whispering just enough for Lily to hear. "We don't make space for special people like you if they don't follow the rules." And then, like a small but deep wound, Candace whispered a malicious remark: "Maybe you should stay home, where people like you belong." A cold shiver ran down Lily's spine. Apollo immediately leaned in closer, pressing his body against Lily's, stopping the shiver from erupting into a tremor. In that moment, it seemed as though even the rain outside had quieted down, making room for the silent sound of injustice and cruelty creeping through the waiting hall. Lily clenched the leash in her hand. She was used to the questioning, used to the condescending stares of strangers. But today, the coldness and malice in Candace's eyes felt like a new blade's harper deeper. Apollo, sensing his owner's mood, leaned forward, positioning himself firmly in front of Lily, his large frame becoming a solid wall. The dog did not growl, did not bark. He simply stood there steadfast and unyielding. Candace's eyes flicked over them, her face showing an expression as if she had encountered an unacceptable nuisance. She pulled out the walkie-talkie clipped to her belt, pressing the button with an almost gleeful urgency. "Security, Gate B12. I need assistance immediately. A case of non-compliance with animal transport regulations." Candace's voice was cold, not a word extra. The static of the walkie-talkie crackled, and only a few minutes later, a large security officer in a dark blue uniform ambled down the hallway. Heckin Dawson was chewing gum, his demeanor lazy as if he'd been called over for a child's prank. Candace, seeing the person she called for, straightened up, folding her arms across her chest with a look of artificial authority. Here she gestured toward Lily and Apollo with a flick of her chin. "A passenger with an animal. No valid paperwork." Lily quickly held out her certification card, her voice small but clear. "He's a legal service dog. This is Apollo's certification, per the Americans with Disabilities Act." Ken glanced at the card, but instead of taking it to check as required, he simply shrugged dismissively. "Chewing loudly, rules are rules," he said lazily, chewing his gum. "If the attendant reported it, I've got to follow through. You and the dog need to leave the gate now." Lily heard each word like punches to her chest. Beside her, Apollo remained motionless, like a fortress. The dog turned his head slightly, his intelligent brown eyes locking onto Ken's gaze, as if a silent warrior preparing to face injustice. Candace smirked, a thin, cruel smile stretching across her face. "She's still resisting," Candace said louder, intentionally allowing nearby passengers to hear. "Not cooperating with security." A few passengers curiously lifted their heads. Some shook their heads, others muttered about trouble and kids causing a scene. Lily tightened her grip on the leash until her knuckles were white. She wanted to shout that she had done nothing wrong, that Apollo was her lifeline. But Lily's throat felt dry, choked by something invisible, the fear of being scorned. Ken tugged at the walkie-talkie on his shoulder, urging, "Let's go, kid. Otherwise, I'll have to use force." A cold, detached statement, an order that swept away all humanity from those who were supposed to protect. The airport lights reflected coldly off Lily's face, making her look even more pale. Her eyes welled with tears, but she clenched her jaw, fighting to keep them in. Apollo took a half step forward, standing completely between Lily and Ken. Candace raised an eyebrow, her smirk widening as though she was enjoying a tragic play. "See?" Candace whispered, her voice almost sweet in its cruelty. "Your dog is threatening the security officer. An extremely dangerous act." Lily opened her mouth to protest, but the sound of heavy footsteps cut her off. From afar, Captain Vernon Hayes was approaching. His pilot's uniform was sharp, his square jaw and commanding face exuding authority, his steps heavy and decisive. A man whose mere presence, could make an entire room hold its breath from the weight of his presence. He stopped in front of Lily, Apollo, Candace, and Ken. Vernon's gaze swept quickly over the situation, as if inspecting a simple technical fault before takeoff. Not a long look at Lily, not a glance at Apollo, just cold, reflexive professionalism. Candace immediately stepped forward, whispering her explanation. Vernon nodded lightly, then turned to Lily, his voice cold like the tarmac outside. For safety reasons, your animal cannot board this flight. But Lily choked, her hands trembling as she offered the certification. He's a service dog. I need Apollo to control my seizures. Without him, I can't fly. Vernon didn't touch the card. He didn't look into Lily's panicked eyes. He simply folded his arms, lifting his chin as if making a judgment from above. Rules are rules, he said. The safety of all passengers cannot be compromised for an individual case. Behind him, Candace subtly nodded, satisfied. Ken stepped back a bit, as if he had completed his task. Lily felt like the world was collapsing around her. In that moment, she wasn't just being denied the right to fly. She was being denied the right to exist as a human being. Apollo, sensing the rising pain in his owner, gently pressed against Lily's leg, leaning into her, offering his calm warmth. Once again, in a world filled with prejudice and coldness, only Apollo and only Apollo understood her. Lily shut her eyes tightly, fighting back the tears. But inside her, a small flame began to smolder, not the flame of impulsive anger, but the flame of resilience, of a child who had learned to fight not with strength, but with courage. A battle that Lily had no choice but to continue. Lily felt her heart constrict, each beat heavy and unfamiliar. The world around her seemed to shrink, leaving only cold stares and the dry words of those who did not understand, and did not want to understand. Apollo stood beside her, his sharp brown eyes still fixed on Vernon and Candace, but not with hostility, rather with resolve. The large dog knew that only his silence could help Lily weather this storm. But Lily no longer wanted to remain silent. She could not bear it any longer. Candace's words echoed in her mind, cruel and digging deep into her tender heart. You don't belong here. Those words felt like a curse, like a heavy stone pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. But inside her, a small flame began to burn, the flame of what was right, of the right to live without being discriminated against, of belief in herself and in fairness. That flame grew stronger. Lily lifted her head high, no longer bowing her face before the judging eyes. She stared directly into Captain Vernon Hayes, the tall, imposing pilot standing before her, the one person she believed could protect everyone on the flight. But today, he was not protecting her. He was standing in her way, with all the courage an 11-year-old child could muster. Lily spoke. This is Apollo's legal service dog certification. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA, no one has the right to deny us boarding. Lily's voice, though small, rang out in that moment like a powerful declaration. We have the right to fly. Apollo stood steadfast by her side, solid as a fortress. His eyes reflected the same unwavering determination, a perfect guardian. He could not and would never abandon this child, even if the world around her wanted to. Candace stared at Lily with contempt. Does this girl think she can change the rules? The question wasn't a challenge, it was disdain. But this time, Lily didn't lower her head, didn't back down. Lily raised the certification high, holding it firmly in her hands, her gaze sweeping over the passengers watching the confrontation. Some averted their eyes, as if protecting themselves from a truth too uncomfortable. Others watched quietly, but a few, perhaps those tired of discrimination, stared to look at her differently, not with disdain, but with empathy. She's right. It's her right. A woman standing nearby, in her 40s, whispered. A man in a black suit, who had been secretly glancing at his phone, now lifted his gaze and silently nodded, as though recognizing something important. Vernon stood still, his arms still crossed, eyes fixed on Lily. But in his gaze, something began to shift, not confusion or immediate remorse, but hesitation, a reluctance to face a truth he could no longer deny. "We're violating a passenger's rights," Lily exclaimed, her voice stronger now, no longer trembling. "You can't disregard a life because of a nonsensical rule. Apollo is my lifeline. He's not just a dog, he's a protector." Lily was no longer the small, weak child people thought she was. She was fighting for her rights, a child demanding the respect she deserved. Candace's gaze began to change, no longer the arrogance it had been earlier. She began to realize that she could not easily defeat a child with such resilience. Vernon also seemed to hesitate, his face tight as though torn between responsibility and the invisible power he had long been accustomed to protecting. "This is an unforgivable situation," Vernon said, his voice suddenly colder, as if trying to reclaim the authority that had been shaken. But Lily wasn't afraid. She simply looked at him, her gaze resolute and unflinching. "You can throw me out, but I won't leave," she declared, "because I have the right, and I will stand up for that right." A silence descended over the waiting area, and the passengers around them began paying closer attention. No longer glancing furtively, but watching with unusual interest, the gazes began to shift, from suspicion to empathy, from ridicule to respect. Lily felt that shift, the strength in fighting for what was right, even as a small child. But she knew this battle didn't end here, because Apollo would never leave her, and she would never give up. At Gate B12, time seemed to freeze. The sound of the rain outside continued to pour down relentlessly, almost mirroring the tension that enveloped every corner of the terminal. Yet in that moment, there was a strange stillness, as everyone around became aware of what was unfolding, what was right, and what was wrong. Even if not everyone had the courage to speak up, Lily stood there, small yet strong, amidst the scrutinizing eyes and the cold light from the overhead lamps. She did not look away from Captain Vernon Hayes, the man who was supposed to protect her, but who now stood in front of her like a wall, blocking her rightful claim. Apollo stood beside her, unwavering and silent, but his eyes spoke volumes. He was not just a regular service dog. He was the soul of safety, Lily's loyal companion, her lifeline in a sea of injustice. Vernon remained still, arms crossed, eyes locked on Lily, as though weighing everything in his mind. But no matter how much he tried to hide it, the undeniable truth was that Lily and Apollo were being treated unfairly. Candace, the head flight attendant, had stepped back, standing like a shadow, her gaze still fixed on Lily, a smirk of satisfaction creeping across her face. She no longer needed to speak, for it seemed everything had already been decided. Both Vernon and Candace believed they had enough power to impose whatever they wanted on a child. But unexpectedly, a subtle movement from the crowd around them shifted everything. A man, around 50, with silver hair, stood at the back of the row of seats, having observed the entire confrontation. He said nothing, but quietly pulled out his phone and began recording. A small act, but one with powerful consequences, in a world where justice isn't always achieved. Today, the truth would not be hidden. Seeing this, a few other passengers followed suit, taking out their phones. The loudspeakers overhead continued with announcements about delayed flights. But the eyes of the crowd were no longer fixed on their phones or boarding passes. People began to pay attention. Phones were raised, and cameras started rolling. The pressure from the crowd began to mount. Vernon, once standing firm like a stone statue, could now feel the shift in the atmosphere. Not because he immediately felt guilty, but because he realized his leadership was being questioned, challenged right before his eyes. "Captain Hayes, you can't just stand there and remain silent," a woman spoke up, her voice filled with concern. "We all see it clearly. This is discrimination. I think it's time you do what's right." All eyes were now on Vernon. The attention from the crowd wasn't just out of curiosity, but out of judgment. People were watching, waiting for him to make a decision. This was no longer just a simple situation. It was a challenge to dignity and justice. Vernon furrowed his brow, his fists clenched as if he were fighting with himself. But in that moment, all his patience and confidence seemed to waver. He turned to look at Candace, their eyes meeting in a long silence. Candace, realizing that the game was no longer in her hands, tried to give Vernon a look of resolve, as if wanting to force him to do as she wished. But something in Vernon's gaze unsettled her. Throughout his career, he had been accustomed to leading, to making decisions, and to no one standing in his way. But today, he realized that there were decisions that were not just about rules but about conscience, about respecting human dignity. Finally, Vernon took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as though releasing a heavy burden. "All right, I'll change my decision." His voice was not loud, but each word landed like a heavy blow in the still air. Lily lifted her head, her eyes lighting up. Apollo stood tall, as though sensing the shift in the air. The dog gave a look, almost like a victory glance, toward Vernon. "We will allow you and Apollo to board the flight," Vernon continued, his eyes never leaving Lily. "But I want to make one thing clear. Next time, the paperwork needs to be in order before boarding. Our regulations are in place to ensure the safety of everyone." Lily nodded, saying nothing. Feeling a rush of relief flooding her body, she looked at Apollo, and a small, gentle smile, full of meaning, appeared on her lips. Candace stood frozen. She looked at Vernon, then at the passengers around her, her eyes losing their smugness, replaced by an unmistakable confusion. The crowd had now turned their backs on her, not because of what they had said, but because they had witnessed the truth being exposed, and they had chosen to stand on the side of what was right. Vernon turned and nodded at Ken, signaling him. Ken, still a bit uncomfortable, but unable to refuse, walked over to Lily and Apollo and said, "Let's go to the plane." The flight Lily thought would never continue was now open before her, and more than anything, she knew that Apollo, her loyal friend, would always be there, protecting her. The crowd stood silently, watching as Lily and Apollo walked past. Lily led the way, a weary smile on her face, yet full of pride, stepping through the eyes that no longer held contempt, but admiration. The plane's door closed with a soft yet heavy sound, as if shutting out all the dark events that had unfolded in the terminal. Lily felt each step she took with Apollo light, no longer weighed down by the tension of the airport. This flight, which had begun with injustice and pain, had now become a new journey, a journey not just about the destination, but about the triumph of resilience. Lily sat down in her seat, a special one, spacious enough for both her and Apollo. The large dog immediately sat beside her, slightly leaning as though his mission had been accomplished. But truly, for Apollo, this mission had never ended. Every bark, every wag of his tail, every glance spoke of protection and unwavering loyalty. The airplane was now quiet. After a series of tense events, the passengers began to find their peace again. A few flight attendants walked by, their faces no longer stiff and unwelcoming. They no longer looked at Lily and Apollo with suspicion or pity. Instead, their eyes had shifted to respect. The passengers around them seemed to have recognized the strength within this young girl. She was not someone to fear or judge. She was a warrior, small, but unyielding. Those seated nearby began whispering to each other, no longer with criticism or disdain, but with stories of courage, of the change they had just witnessed. A middle-aged man, who had stood up earlier and recorded the video, now gently turned to the woman sitting beside him and whispered, "That kid is amazing. We should have done something a long time ago." His words weren't just praise. They were an acknowledgement of what they had just seen. Lily's resilience had sparked a light in the darkness, one that the crowd had silently observed but dared not confront. Now, they could no longer turn their backs on the truth. From the front of the plane, Vernon, the captain, sat in the cockpit, his hands firmly on the controls, but his mind couldn't escape Lily and Apollo. The image of the small girl sitting there, leaning on Apollo, while everyone around had shifted their attitudes, left him with an unfamiliar feeling inside, not guilt or judgment, but a profound awareness of his own weakness. His decision earlier to let Lily and Apollo board had changed everything. And deep inside, something within him began to change, a realization he had never imagined he would feel. The atmosphere in the cockpit, once cold and detached, had softened. Vernon sighed, no longer fixated on the task at hand, but now reflecting on a larger picture, a picture where, for the first time, he saw himself not standing at the top, but standing with others, facing the mistakes he had once overlooked. Back in the cabin, Lily still sat quietly, saying nothing, but within her, a fire burned brightly. This was not a victory she could share with words. It was a victory of feeling, a feeling of freedom, of the right to be protected and to exist without being seen as a burden or a nuisance. And most importantly, Apollo was still with her, still loyal, still steadfast like a sentry on the battlefield. The safety instructions echoed through the plane, but Lily wasn't paying attention. She had heard them countless times, but today everything around her seemed insignificant, except for Apollo, the only companion she truly had. She gently stroked Apollo's fur, feeling the warmth from his body. "Thank you, Apollo," she whispered, her voice as sweet as the wind, a thank you that words could never fully express. Apollo turned his head, his deep brown eyes looking at her with sincerity. No need for words, for in the silence, their friendship, loyalty, and protection spoke volumes. The plane began to ascend. It soared into the sky, leaving the cold ground behind, rising into the dark but hopeful heavens. The gentle vibrations of the plane in the vast expanse of space made Lily feel safer, as if she were surrounded by an invisible protective circle, not only from Apollo but from the people who had been watching, those who were beginning to look at her with different eyes. Lily closed her eyes, feeling each gentle sway, and in that moment, she understood that she had done something far greater than she had realized. She had not just defeated discrimination. She had opened a door not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt forgotten, diminished. And Apollo, the large dog full of love, was the only friend she needed on this journey. Everything had changed. The world around her, the passengers, even Vernon and Candace, had witnessed it, and that would never fade. The plane slowly ascended through the thick clouds, heading toward the pitch-black sky. The roar of the engines could not mask the tense silence that filled the cabin. Most of the passengers kept their heads down, eyes glued to their screens or books, seemingly trying to escape unwanted stories. But there was a different atmosphere spreading, a shift, a quiet awakening in the hearts of those sitting on this flight. Lily sat there, her gaze fixed on Apollo's leash, but her mind could not stop thinking about everything that had happened. She had fought and she had won. She had stood firm, not because of physical strength, but because of another kind of power, her belief in justice and the right to live. Apollo sat beside her, his head resting on her lap. Every time the plane hit a small bump, she could feel his steadiness, like a fortress protecting her. Not just physical strength, but comfort in every glance, every deep breath. Apollo didn't need to speak, but Lily understood it. Al was her only true companion on this journey. A passenger, someone Lily hadn't noticed before, gently pulled her seat closer, turned toward the girl, and smiled warmly. The woman, dressed in a thick coat, looked concerned when she saw Apollo. But her concern was no longer fear, but care. She spoke softly, just loud enough for Lily to hear. "Little one, I don't know if I can help, but I think you're truly very brave." Lily looked up, her eyes struggling to comprehend the empathy in the woman's words. She looked into the woman's tear-filled eyes. The woman wasn't looking at Lily as a passerby, but as someone who had seen the strength within her. "Thank you," Lily whispered, her voice small but carrying heartfelt gratitude. She had never imagined anyone would understand, but today, the world had changed. At that moment, Captain Vernon Hayes stepped out of the cockpit. His face had noticeably changed, no longer the rigid pride of someone who only knew rules, but now softened with understanding. He walked through the cabin, his gaze pausing briefly on Lily and Apollo, Although he didn't speak, the change in his attitude was unmistakable. He approached a passenger sitting by the window, a middle-aged man whose expression seemed conflicted, as though he were struggling with what he had just witnessed. The man, seeing the change in Vernon's eyes, put down his book and turned back to look at Lily. "Little one, I don't think I could have done what you did in your situation," he said, not in a hollow compliment, but with a sincere understanding, from someone who had once thought discrimination and injustice were acceptable. Lily's actions had changed his perspective. A moment of silence stretched out, and when he spoke again, his gaze was softer, no longer filled with disdain for the resistance of a child. "I'm sorry for what happened, and I hope that we can make this world a little fairer." Lily felt something different in the air. She knew that while this fight was far from over, today, a part of the world had changed. And that change, through her small but powerful actions, had sparked an undeniable ripple. The plane continued to glide through the dark clouds, occasionally shaking slightly. But no one felt fear or worry anymore. The cabin felt renewed, as if it were a new space, where humanity and courage began to take over. Captain Vernon walked past the rows of seats, his gaze stopping once more on the seat where Lily and Apollo sat. He stood there for a few seconds, as if feeling the change in the atmosphere. Although he didn't say another word, his eyes spoke volumes. From behind, Candace also passed by, still in her flight attendant uniform, but this time, she no longer carried the smug or victorious expression. Although she didn't face Lily directly, her gaze had changed, no longer filled with contempt. There was now a hint of remorse, of realization. She walked by, and though she didn't speak, there was a sense of understanding, a shift in her eyes, as if Candace had finally understood that her actions had not been right. The plane continued its ascent, while below, a story of the struggle for justice, of defending the rights of the vulnerable, was being told through the glances and small but powerful exchanges. Lily sat there, not with pride for her victory, but with a peace she had never felt before. Apollo, her loyal friend, remained by her side, the strongest protector she could ever have. And on that plane, everyone, whether they wanted to or not, had become a part of this story. A story of resilience, loyalty, and the fight for justice that we must all work toward. As the plane began its descent, the hum of the engines was like a soothing melody, gently closing the long journey. Lily sat quietly, her hands still resting lightly on Apollo's back, her loyal companion. She could clearly feel the change in the atmosphere, the shift she had helped create. Her journey was not just a flight. It was a story of resilience and justice that she had set in motion. This feeling was not excitement, but a strange peace, a peace full of strength. She could sense the change in the eyes of the passengers around her, in the way they looked at her, as if they no longer saw a weak child, but a victor. A few passengers, those who had been observing from the beginning, began to open their hearts. A middle-aged man, who had previously only glanced through the gap of his phone, now looked at Lily and Apollo with a different gaze, not one of surprise or criticism, but of respect. "Little one, I think I've understood something important today," the man said softly, but with a deep appreciation. "Thank you for showing us the power of resilience." Lily looked back, a bit surprised. She hadn't expected that a stranger could understand her so well. She smiled, and her eyes conveyed a thank you that needed no words. Apollo slightly lifted his head, his sharp brown eyes looking at the man as if responding to his empathy. This dog was not just a friend, he was Lily's protector, a warrior in this challenging journey. The plane began to ascend into the sky, lifting away from the last of the clouds. The slight vibrations of the plane seemed trivial compared to what Lily had endured. But with each shake, she felt the certainty of Apollo beside her. He was always there, always protecting her, just as the people around her were beginning to change, starting to stand up, even with small actions, to protect what was right. Captain Vernon, the leader of the flight, stepped out of the cockpit and walked through the cabin once again. His gaze was no longer filled with arrogance or rigidity. This time, His face seemed calmer, but not because he had dismissed the situation. Rather, it was because he had understood the importance of the decisions he had made. As he walked past Lily, his eyes no longer saw her as a troublesome passenger, but as someone who had stood up for justice. "I truly apologize for what happened," Vernon said, his voice gentler, no longer cold and indifferent. "We could have done better, and I will ensure that every passenger is treated with respect from now on." Lily looked at him, her eyes free of anger or resentment. She simply looked at him with understanding. Not everyone knows what's right immediately, but the change in Vernon's eyes showed that he had learned a valuable lesson, and perhaps would never forget it. As the plane continued to glide through the clouds, a passenger from the back of the cabin came forward. The woman who had earlier thanked Lily. She stopped beside the girl, not out of curiosity or to cause a disturbance, but for another reason. She felt a change within herself. "Little one, I want to tell you something," she smiled, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "I am older, and I've seen many things in my life, but today, I've seen something I never thought of. Both courage and resilience you showed. I will remember the image of you standing up, not just for yourself, but for everyone who needs to be respected equally." Lily just smiled lightly, saying nothing, but she felt that her actions had touched other hearts, inspiring those who hadn't known they, too, could stand up to protect what was right. These words were not just praise, but an awakening, a call to action. The plane continued its journey through the vast sky. No longer was the cabin silent like before. Small conversations began to emerge across the cabin, not about the flight or daily worries, but about change. Stories of courage, of the resilience of a child, and of the people who had witnessed it, began to be shared. No one saw Lily and Apollo as weak anymore. Vernon returned to the cockpit, but his gaze had changed. He was no longer just a captain. He was a learner, a person who had realized that, in the biggest decisions, sometimes we don't just need to look at rules or regulations. We need to look at people, at compassion and justice. For Lily and Apollo, their journey wasn't over yet. The challenges ahead were still there, but now, Lily knew that nothing could stop her. She had Apollo by her side, and more than that, she now had the inspiration to change the world around her. And on this flight, Lily was not just a small child. She was a symbol of courage, a living testament to the strength of a heart that refuses to be defeated, and to the belief that every person has the right to be respected and live as themselves. As the plane finally touched down on the runway, the strong vibrations in the passenger cabin made everyone quickly tighten their seatbelts. Though the atmosphere on this flight had completely changed from when it first departed, the excitement could still be felt in the air. It was an excitement not born from the safety of the flight, but from the change, from the sense that humanity had quietly crept into the hearts of every passenger on board. Lily sat upright, no longer feeling the anxiety that had once gripped her. Apollo remained by her side, like an invisible shield, but this time, the strength he brought was not only in physical protection, but also in the mental fortitude he had provided throughout the journey. The large dog was not just a companion, but a symbol of loyalty, of the willingness to sacrifice for a greater cause. The cabin fell eerily quiet as the plane slowly made its way to the gate, as if all the passengers were reflecting on what they had witnessed, the changes they had seen within themselves. Perhaps no one had imagined that a routine flight could turn into a lesson on justice, courage, and standing up against injustice. A man sitting in the row ahead, the one who had filmed the incident earlier, began to lift his phone, but this time, he didn't turn it to Lily and Apollo. He turned it toward himself, reflecting on the words he had thought, the thoughts clouded by his own self-satisfaction before. The man quickly typed on his phone, and when he looked up, his gaze no longer held contempt, but self-reflection. "We won't change if we just watch from the outside," he muttered, almost reminding himself, then turned to the woman sitting next to him, whispering, "I never thought I could change." Even in a small situation like this, the woman sitting next to him nodded, offering a small smile, saying nothing more, but the change in her gaze said it all. Lily and Apollo's story hadn't just touched one heart, it was quietly awakening a community. From the back, Captain Vernon Hayes emerged from the cockpit and once again walked through the cabin. He no longer rushed, no longer carried the rigid, cold demeanor he had at the start of the flight. Vernon walked through the rows of seats, not looking at the announcement boards or regulations, but instead, his eyes focused on Lily and Apollo with deep respect. When he stopped at their seats, his gaze was no longer haunted by the difficulty of his job, but by a profound awareness of what had occurred. He stood there for a moment, saying nothing, simply looking at the girl and her dog. His eyes reflected remorse, but also hope for something greater. "Lily, Apollo, I'm truly grateful to you," Vernon said, his voice gentle, but loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "You've taught me and everyone here a lesson about resilience and fairness. Those things can't be buried in rules or policies. They must be carried out through action." Lily simply smiled faintly. She didn't need to say much to feel that she had won this fight. It wasn't just a victory for her own rights, but a victory for a system that Lily had shown could change when viewed with fairness. And without discrimination, the passengers around her began to clap. At first, the applause was small and hesitant, but soon the clapping grew louder, echoing throughout the cabin, a sincere thank you to Lily, to Apollo, and for what they had brought. This applause wasn't just for a child, it was for everyone who had ever been looked down upon, ignored in a society ready to discriminate. The clapping, though not loud, was full of power. It was the acknowledgement from people that change was necessary in this world. As the plane rolled to the gate, the passengers didn't rush to leave. They stood slowly, as if not wanting to end a journey that had unexpectedly had such a profound impact. A man stood up, removed his hat, and looked at Lily and Apollo, not as a passerby, but as someone who had realized a great truth. "Thank you for showing me what's most important in life," he said softly, with deep appreciation. Lily didn't respond, just smiled lightly, a smile that she knew had changed the small world around her. With Apollo by her side, she walked off the plane, and as she stepped out, the emotions began to ripple outward. Her story hadn't just ended on a flight. It had become part of a movement tone that she had never anticipated, but one that she and Apollo had started. And as the final door of the plane closed, the world outside would continue to turn. But in the hearts of each passenger, there would be something that would never be forgotten. A story of courage, of standing up for justice, and of never leaving anyone behind. As Lily and Apollo stepped out of the airport, the silence that had once hung in the air dissipated, replaced by an undercurrent of a storm slowly forming around them. The community of passengers no longer remained quiet. They no longer stood on the sidelines, indifferent to what had just happened. Phones were pulled out, cameras turned on, and pictures began to be taken not just to capture a moment, but to remember a story. Lily and Apollo's story was not merely a battle to reclaim the rights of a child. It was a wave of change quietly spreading through every corner of society. What had started as a small incident on a flight had become a vivid example of courage, respect, and fairness which not everyone could easily accept. People began sharing their stories on social media, with posts, videos, and photos from passengers on the flight quickly circulating. At first, it was just a few simple status updates, but gradually, the story became a major topic. Strangers began to find solidarity and joined in the same voice. Lily was no longer just a small child, she had become a symbol of change. A video was posted online immediately after the plane landed. The video captured the moment when the passengers applauded Lily and Apollo, with Captain Vernon standing quietly in the background. Within hours, the video spread like wildfire, garnering millions of views and shares. Comments began flooding in from all over the world. Some people shared personal experiences of times they had stood up to defend their own rights. Others expressed regret for the times they had ignored injustice before. This wave of change didn't stop with the passengers on the flight. It spread beyond the airport, into neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. Lily and Apollo's story began to shift long-held perspectives in society. Injustice was no longer seen as the concern of a few. It belonged to all of us, and only when we stand up can we change it. In a small corner of the online community, Sarah Mitchell, a woman who had faced discrimination in the past, posted an emotional write-up. She wrote, "Lily isn't just fighting for herself. She's fighting for all the people who've been looked down upon and deprived of the right to truly live. I see myself in her story. I stand up because I know if Lily can do it, I can too." Sarah's post quickly drew attention from others in similar situations. Lily and Apollo's story had sparked a movement not just against racial discrimination, but also in defense of the rights of the vulnerable in society. People began to reevaluate their unconscious actions, the prejudices that had been instilled for years, and they realized that only by standing up could they bring about change. But this change wasn't confined to the online community. It began to infiltrate organizations, businesses, and public agencies. A non-profit organization dedicated to disability rights immediately reached out to Lily and her mother. They wanted to collaborate to spread this story and help those facing similar struggles. The next day, an urgent meeting was called at the airline's headquarters. Captain Vernon Hayes joined the meeting with a newfound seriousness. This time, he wasn't just a leader. He was a student in a lesson about compassion and justice. He and his colleagues had decided to change procedures to ensure that no one, whether a passenger or an employee, would have to endure discrimination again. Candace Miller, the head flight attendant, was also part of that meeting. Although she no longer wore the arrogant expression she once had, it was clear that her conscience had been awakened. She began to realize that what she had done was not simply about following regulations, but about ethics and respect for people. An organization had already begun reviewing and reassessing all procedures, retraining staff on how to treat passengers, not just in terms of laws, but with humanity. Lily, unaware that she had become a symbol for a larger movement, knew only that her story had captured the attention of others. She continued her journey, not with pride, but with a firm belief in justice. But one thing she couldn't have anticipated: her story had helped many others realize that they, too, could stand up for their rights. That courage was not just stubbornness, but an understanding of what is right. In another place, at a school, students who had watched Lily's video began sharing her story in their classrooms. A writing competition on justice was held, with the theme "Where Does Courage Come From?" The essays were not just about Lily, but about each student's personal victories in their own struggles against injustice and discrimination. This wave was no longer just a story of a child. It was the story of a community, of a world changing, thanks to the resilience and courage of an 11-year-old child. Lily and Apollo's story had begun a new journey, a journey not of personal victory, but of victory for justice, for freedom, and for the respect of human dignity. And each day, that story would continue to spread, like an unquenchable fire, until every person could stand up and protect themselves. As Lily and Apollo walked into the airport terminal that morning, neither of them could have known that they were stepping into a new chapter of their lives. Their story had not only become a lesson in justice, but also a profound shift in how people viewed respect for human dignity and personal rights. They were no longer just small individuals. They had become the leaders of a peaceful revolution in awareness and action. This change didn't happen overnight, but was the result of a series of interconnected events, linked by simple yet powerful actions. They didn't win with physical strength, but with resilience, understanding, and courage. These traits led them to an unexpected outcome that had changed their own lives, and the lives of many others. Back to Lily, she was no longer the fearful child who once dreaded being left behind. After everything that had transpired, she now understood that justice is not something that comes naturally. It must be fought for, spoken out for, and at times, it requires standing up to those who don't want change. But when the right action is taken, It has a profound impact, not only at the moment, but long afterward. Today, Lily stood tall beside Apollo, not just as a child, but as a symbol of courage. She didn't need to say anything more, because everyone had already seen what needed to be seen. The passengers on that flight, those who witnessed the injustice and the change she brought, were no longer indifferent to the pain of others. They had learned that we all have the power to change the world around us. Simply by standing up for what is right, Lily's story began to spread far and wide. Schools, non-profit organizations, and even large corporations began changing their staff training processes. Kindness, fairness, and respect for people became core standards in how they interacted with others. From a small incident on a flight, Lily proved that each individual could create a huge change in their community. 1 week after the flight, Lily and Apollo were invited to attend the National Justice Memorial yearly event that honors those who have stood up for justice and equality. As they walked onto the stage, the lights from cameras and flashes illuminated everything. But Lily was no longer the fearful child. She stood there, head held high, as a true victor. Her story wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been overlooked and discriminated against, simply because they were different. Apollo, standing beside Lily, also received the recognition he deserved. The loyal dog had not only protected Lily, but had become a symbol of protection for the vulnerable. No words could fully express the friendship and loyalty of Apollo. When the host invited Lily to speak, she stood up, no longer hesitant in her voice, no longer trembling. She looked at the crowd and began, "Thank you all for supporting me. But I'm not the only one who needs support. We all can change this world, one action at a time. We can stand up to defend what is right and not let injustice control our lives. I did this, and I believe each one of you can do it too." Her steady gaze and the confidence in her voice made the entire hall fall silent in admiration. This wasn't just a speech from a child. It was a call for everyone to understand that change begins with us. As Lily finished her speech, the entire hall stood up and applauded. The room resonated with the applause, not because of the prominence of an individual, but because her actions had touched the hearts of everyone. They didn't just clap for Lily, but for the hope that we can change the world with small but powerful actions. From that day on, Lily and Apollo were no longer just fighting for themselves. They had become living symbols of a revolution in justice and kindness. Their story was read in thousands of schools, shared on social media, and became a part of the culture of change that more and more people felt compelled to join. But this story didn't end there. Lily and Apollo had changed the world in ways they could never have imagined. But above all, they had taught us the most important lesson: every righteous action from one person can change the world, and these changes will create a better community where no one is left behind. And as their story continues to be told, Lily knew that she had done what she believed was right. She didn't need to do anything more because the change had already been created. And that was the most important thing. In the end, Lily and Apollo were not just winners. They were inspirations to us all. They helped us realize that each individual can create great change, simply with courage and resilience.